Well, hello again. This is Brandon Moore. I'm the CEO and founder of BKM PC Certified Public Accountants, and I'm here today with Maggie, my Director of Operations, and we're bringing you another episode of Coaching for Profit. Thanks for joining us, and if these have been helpful to you, please give us a like, give us a review. We'd love that, and share it with somebody else that you think it's going to help. That would be fantastic, just to get this out to people that it will help. That's why we're doing this, is to help small business owners earn more and keep more of what they earn, and to help them in the day-to-day operations, the little things in business and being an entrepreneur that they don't teach in school, and experience really is the best teacher here. So how are you, Maggie?
Good. How are you?
Thanks for joining me today. What are we talking about today?
We are talking about knowing your value, something that is a little bit more complicated than you would think it would be. You think my value is how much money I bring in, but that's not true. I think there's a lot. I know there's a lot more to it than just that. So.
It's going to be talking about pricing and your products and services. And as a professional, we think in terms of pricing our services, but there's also, construction contractors and restaurants that have pricing models that may be hurting their business because they're not thinking of all the costs that go into it. They're not thinking of the profit that they need to make. And so we're going to talk about some of the things that are important in pricing those products and services, and how much value you're bringing to those products and services. So what's the most important thing in business and as an entrepreneur?
I would assume bringing in money, making a profit.
That's right, making money and cash. I was reading a book by Jim Collins, and he was talking about a professor that pushed into his mind early on that you pay your bills with cash. And so if you're not making money, you can't pay your bills. And so I think there's three things that you have that are important when talking about your pricing model. And that's knowing your costs, knowing your market, and then knowing your value. So let's break that down. So knowing your costs, what are the costs that go into your product or service?
Are you asking me? Or are you saying that's what we're looking for? Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you were being
rhetorical.
Yes. What are the costs? Well, obviously, coming from like a business owner, and I'm not a business owner, but if I was going to pretend that I was a business owner, you think of first, what are those costs that are just right in front of your face? So my materials, or my staff that I'm paying, or the building that I'm working out of, my internet, those things that are just right in front of your face and like no brainers. But something that I think that people don't think about are those behind the scenes costs. So the cost of my time, the cost of my, I'm trying to think of better examples of those background costs, but there are a lot of them that people might forget about when we're talking about calculating what those costs are.
Well, there are those three basic costs are in everything that we do. Materials, if you're selling a product, or if you're a construction contractor and part of your service is a product, materials and supplies is a big part of that. Next is your labor, what you pay somebody else, or even your own personal labor. I had a story, a friend of mine that was working on one of my rent houses. We were talking about his pricing and why he went into business. And he said, I just felt like I could go out and do a better job for customers and the people I was working for. And so I went out and so I said, well, what are you charging for? And he's, well, I'm charging for my materials plus, my labor. And I said, well, wait a second. If you're only charging for your materials and your labor, then when are you ever going to be able to hire somebody else? And so that labor cost isn't just the labor that you are working on. What would you pay somebody else to do that job? And you have to think in those terms. And then the last part is overhead, which you were talking about earlier, is the fixed cost, the background costs. When we have we have our variable costs, which are utilities, any cost that increases by the amount of services that we offer to our clients is a variable cost. And any cost that stays the same over time is considered a fixed cost. So those fixed costs are your rent, maybe software that you buy, your internet fees. But the variable costs are your paper, supplies, your some software is paid by use. And so that would be considered a variable cost. And so those three basic components should be in your pricing model. But there should be actually four components in a pricing model, and that's the materials, labor, overhead, and then did I say something right? Materials, labor, and overhead.
There you go.
Plus your profit. What do you want to earn towards the company's bottom line? And a lot of small business owners go out and they put themselves as the labor. That's their profit because they are the only laborer. But if you have that mindset, if you think like that, then you'll never be able to expand. You'll never be able to grow. And that might be fine with you, but you may be undervaluing that product and service.
That makes me think of, there's an episode, do you watch The Office? There's an episode of The Office where Michael Scott goes off and makes his own paper company. And he's done the math. He's got the materials and he's only got 3 employees and he's doing all of the labor himself, all the deliveries, all of that stuff. He's like, we're going to be making profit in 6 months. They go see an accountant to say hey, can we afford to hire a delivery driver? We're exhausted. And the accountant does the math and includes all of these costs and does, the things that accountants do. And he's like, no, you're going to go out of business in 6 months because they didn't really take into account those variable costs. And they didn't really take into account really how much that labor really was costing them and the time that was costing them. And it was a shock to them. And I know it's so silly because it's a TV show, but if you're not taking a second to really look at, okay, what's my profit? Then that number is what hurts you later.
Left out. It gets left out. When all you price is your labor and you don't put a profit component into your pricing model, you won't make money. And it should be a profit number that's based on the next two things that we're going to talk about is your market and your value, so that you are getting an adequate compensation for the work that you put in. That profit part is your return on investment. Is how much money do you want to make on your bottom line? And so whenever we price our services, we have to have that profit motive in there. And of course, if you don't have profit, why would you even bother getting in business? One of the stories in college they talked about was a guy that was making burritos. And after taking that first course in costs and overhead, he did the calculations and realized that he made more money staying in bed because he was losing 14 cents per burrito.
Oh, no.
So if he just stayed in bed, he didn't lose that money. So he had to rethink his pricing model. So let's go down to the market. What's important in the market? What about the market's important in your pricing model?
I think one of the first things in your market is something that we've talked about in previous podcasts, which is knowing your client. Because if you don't know your client, then you might be overpricing yourself or underpricing yourself for that profit. And what I mean by that is if you don't know who your client is and you set your dollar amount too high, you're never going to bring in any clients. But if you set it too low, you're selling yourself short and you're losing out on that profit. So
yeah, the customers are a big component, and what can they afford? What are they looking for? what dollars do they have to spend? If you're in the entertainment business in Dallas area, the entertainment expenses or entertainment dollars that each individual has seems to be a little bit higher than that in San Angelo. And so just knowing that client mix and that customer mix, even in the DFW market is so diverse, even within its little towns and subtowns, suburbs. The suburb of Westlake is, high dollar. And so their entertainment dollars are pretty high. Whereas if you go into Irving or Grand Prairie or Garland or some of those areas, it's not going to be as high. It's still going to be high, but it's not going to be as high.
Right.
And so knowing those customers, and I actually I'm trying to talk about customers, and I'm actually talking about another thing to know, and that's the location.
Yeah.
From city to city, you're going to have a different cost. And we know that's true based on some of these larger markets or larger companies that sell nationally. If you go to a Lowe's in Austin and look for a certain, piece of hardware or whatever, or supplies or whatever, it's going to be priced a little bit differently than the Lowe's in San Angelo.
Right. Just so crazy to think about, because it's the same product, but it's a different market. It's a different group. And so that's why this discussion is so important, because as a small business owner, you might not initially think on that large scale. You might not think like, oh, my price depends on where I'm located, but it does, just based on that alone. Not even taking into consideration any of the other factors that I'm sure we'll talk about, but it's just.
Well, and you can also take advantage of that price discrepancy. Like for us as a virtual CPA firm, our overhead is very low. And now it used to be pretty high, but now it's a lot lower since we have 90% of our people working from home. We can offer services to people in Virginia and Oregon and California and Montana at prices probably lower than what they see and what they pay, because of one, the overhead that their CPA or their bookkeeping or accounting firm is paying, but also because of that market, prices are just higher.
Right.
Because we're a virtual CPA firm and we're not limited to one location, we've set our price point and at the profit that we're happy with. And so when we offer services to other locations, aside from the additional tax because of the new tax laws and sales tax laws in each location, aside from that, we're going to probably be a little bit better off for the customer in those different locations.
Right.
What else? I kind of led into the other part of the market by talking about the other CPAs in that location, and that's your competitors.
Yeah. I think that's where most people look first, right? Like when they're thinking about pricing, like what are my competitors offering? And especially in a town like San Angelo, where all of the competitors know each other, like all of the restaurant owners know all of the other restaurant owners and they know what they're pricing. But I do think that that's a really easy trap to fall in, because like as a restaurant example, if I can use actual examples, these aren't clients of ours, so I don't know anything about anything, but if I'm Angry Cactus, that's a location here in San Angelo. If I'm looking at the prices that 01 has, which is a similar type of restaurant, I can't necessarily say, oh, well, he's charging this much for this dish, because I don't know those other factors that go into his overhead, and their overheads are different because they're different locations, they're different even within the town. Yeah. But it's still good to kind of use your competitors as a reference, because you don't want to be too far off. Like you don't want, since Angry Cactus and 01 are the same like date night places, but not too fancy, but not fast food kind of places. You don't want to be too far off from each other, because if someone is taking price into consideration when they're going, like, looking for a restaurant, but at the same time, you don't want to like zero in and be like, I got to be charging the same thing they are, because then their profit might be different than your profit based on other factors.
Yeah. And the truth is that price competition between competitors isn't what's drawing them there. Right. And so there's just something that we do as a business advisory work as a competitor analysis, is we'll look at the products that you might have, and then look at the various criteria that customers are looking for in that product. And then you compare it to your closest competitor, and then see how you are weighting in those various criteria, and which ones you want to focus on, because you might be focusing on delivery, whereas the other person is focused on something else. The other competitor is focused on something else. Like for our firm and versus other CPA firms, our firm is focused on technology and being able to serve people remotely without paper, without having to have hand signatures on anything, without being having to. You don't have to leave your home, and we can serve people all over the country because of it. And so our focus is different. So we're not going to compete directly with a local CPA firm based on their price. We're competing on technology.
Right.
But it's helpful to know in the areas what other people are pricing their services at, and seeing the differences in quality and service model and response time and all those things, to see, okay, well, they're charging $1,000 for this service, but because we offer these other conveniences and add-ons, we're going to be a little bit higher. We're going to be $1,200 or something like that. And so, they may not have the add-ons. They may be, just offering that one service and then selling the other add-ons separately. Right. And whereas we might include it with that particular product. So that's how you would analyze your competitors and see where you're at. You definitely don't want to be priced so out of the market to where nobody can afford you. You'll never make a dollar. So you want to know what the other competitors are pricing or selling for, but then what are the differences? What are the value differences? What are the variations of product? What are the add-ons, differences, and really get an understanding of how you compare, because there's not, like you said, with the restaurants, it's not going to be apples to apples anywhere.
Right.
Ambiance is different. Yeah.
I just think that sometimes people, and I've already said this, but I really do think that sometimes people will get in the mindset of trying to you hear those big chain stores say all the time, like, we'll price match our competitors. Like, well, you can come in and bring, if you see a cost of whatever you're needing at Walmart, you can bring it to Target and they'll price match it for you. And, with those bigger companies that works, and that's great and whatever. But as a small business owner, if you're doing that, you're losing out on that. I mean, we've already said this, but you could potentially be losing out on your profit just based on what you just said of the different values, but also the different customers, going back to knowing who your customers are. Because for us, as an example, our customers might be different than another local CPA's customers, because we might service different industries or service a client that values technology more than they value like a face-to-face meeting. And so there's just so many factors. And so knowing those prices is so important, so that you don't, like you said, get yourself out of the market because you're too costly or whatever. But it's a really, you're kind of walking a tightrope there. You want to use it as a reference, but I don't necessarily think it should be your main focus. But that's just kind of something I see people might easily fall into a quick trap.
Yeah, price competition is a trap. If you if you, especially in professional services, but also in restaurants. And
Yeah.
because, we had a client years ago, they've since sold their business and moved away, but, she was, running a small restaurant, and she was making, under $100,000 for years and years and years. And then all of a sudden she jumped over a couple $100,000. And I asked her, I said, well, what happened? What did you do differently? And she said, well, I just, raised my prices by $1 on everything on the menu. And nobody balked at it. Nobody even,
Right.
And that said to me, not only was she didn't really analyze her pricing model, she could have gone higher, but she didn't understand why her customers came to that restaurant.
Right.
And it wasn't price.
Yeah.
It was ambiance. It was a good place to hang out and chat. It was, a certain nostalgic feeling that they got when they went there. So it was a lot of different things that she just didn't understand what made her customers come and visit her store. And so that's why knowing your customers, knowing your price points and your competitors will make a huge deal in your pricing model. So the last thing I want to talk about, and this is my favorite part, is knowing your value. And CPAs, professionals, chiropractors, doctors, lawyers, artists, journalists, all kinds of professionals, anything any product or service that doesn't have materials included in it is all about value.
Yeah.
And this is probably the hardest for old school professionals to understand and to move beyond. What are the three components of your value? It's how much time it takes to do the job, the knowledge it takes to do the job, and then your experience doing the job, doing those types of jobs. There's a story about a mechanic, the guy brought his vehicle into the shop, and the guy said, hey, can you look at this? It's not doing right. And he looks at it for about 15 minutes and then takes one screwdriver out and screws something in, and it works perfectly. And the guy gave him a bill for $1,000. And the guy said, what are you doing? It only took you 15 minutes. It's like, well, yeah. And he said, well, it was only $100 for that 15 minutes to use the screwdriver, but the $900 is knowing which screw to turn.
Yeah.
And so, that's really the value discussion here, is how much time, what's your knowledge base, and your experience.
Can I actually add one? Is that okay?
Yeah.
I have another one that I think really adds to the value, and that's the experience that you bring, not the experience you have, but the client or the customer experience, like how, I don't know, experience might be the wrong word because it's confusing because it's the different version of that word.
Yeah, customer experience is used a lot.
But I think that's a huge part of your value because, you said that it's hard to know that value for, or this value doesn't necessarily apply to people. Well, that's not what you said, but materials, so like a roofer doesn't necessarily take this into consideration but I would be willing to argue that I'm willing to pay more to a roofer who's really nice to me and, does the job quickly and does a good job. Doing the good job comes in. What?
Cleans up after themselves.
Cleans up after themselves, makes the experience easy for me. I don't have to worry about when they're coming, how long they're going to be there. Just my experience. I'm willing to pay more for a roofer that does that than a roofer that's, doesn't take my experience into consideration. And I think that plays into the value in addition to the three things that you already listed. But
right.
I don't know.
That may be more about the brand.
Maybe.
brand integrity is the customer experience is what are you providing? The service that you're providing isn't always just the service.
Right.
That's what you said, is that we're one of the things that we're providing for our clients, being a virtual CPA firm, is convenience.
Right. The client experience is convenient.
Our virtual meetings, people don't have to leave their office, drive 15 minutes to the CPA office, sit down for an hour, drive another 15 minutes home, and then start back work or back to their office and start back. That could be 30 minutes to an hour out of their day that they don't get back.
Right.
And so the convenience of, let's jump on a Zoom meeting, we'll have a conversation, we'll be face to face over the internet. And, we build really good relationships over the internet. My brother works for me in Oregon, and I've met some of our clients up there over Zoom, and it's been really good.
Right.
It's absolutely convenient for them. So that's part of our brand experience. You're right.
And I mean, we've been doing these like client surveys, but I'm telling people listening, but we've been doing these client surveys. And a lot of the time, like one of the questions is like, what about BCAM PC do you like? Like what's our value to you? And a lot of the time the answer is, I just love working with them. They make it so easy. They make my taxes so easy. And that's a part of the value that we're offering is right. What you said, the convenience, making it easy. And so I think that's something that's our experience, but the client experience at a restaurant, that's part of the value too. Like what you were talking about earlier, the ambiance that the restaurant brings or the nostalgia that the restaurant brings, all of that stuff is just, that's the client experience. And that all plays back into the value of the service that you're providing. In addition to, and I'm sorry, I skipped over the three things that you wanted to talk about.
That's great. The value of the service has a lot of different facets. I just came up with the three that came to mind first. And honestly, when we do something really well, like if a client comes in and asks for something and we've never done it before, and then we do it, but we do it really well, and it took us, let's say it took us 15 to 20 hours this time, but next year they need the same thing done, and it only takes us 10 hours, are we going to charge less? And for us, the answer is no. Why? Because the value to the customer hasn't changed.
Right.
The client needed the thing both years. It satisfied their need both times. And the value, doesn't change just because we got more efficient or we got more knowledge in that area.
And in fact,
that's something that people forget.
Right. And I think that when you do things more, I mean, it's inherent. If you do things over and over again, obviously our experience, even though the time it took us was less, our experience was more. And so those things are always going to be going against each other, especially in a value-based service, like being a lawyer or CPA or something like that, because sure, over time, it takes you less and less time to do whatever that service is, but your experience is always going up. So if we're looking at it as a scale, it's always going to equal that amount that your decided price point is.
Yeah. And I had an experience one time at an employer that was paying salaries for people. And some of the people, didn't put in a lot of time, and it frustrated me. And I asked the leader, I said, okay, why are you paying this amount of money to this person? And they hardly ever show up. And his answer was really solid. It was, we pay him to do this job. This job has this amount of value to us. I don't care if he comes into the office all the time. His job was not client service or anything that had to do with being at a particular spot. His job was to get this thing done.
Yeah.
And so the value of that job was what they paid him, whether or not it took 20 hours a week or 40 hours a week.
Right.
That's the value that and so, the person in the job had time to do other things because they just were good enough at that job that were being hired to do that they just didn't need to put in the 40 to 50 hours a week that I felt like they should.
Right. Yeah. And that's one reason I'm glad we moved away from hourly billing at our firm, is because it just doesn't encompass the knowledge and experience that's going into what we're offering. And sometimes it's hard to explain that to clients, especially clients that are used to lawyers, CPAs, that kind of basing it off of an hourly amount. But if you look at the big picture, those hourly amounts just don't, and they can. I mean, there's a lot of people out there that still bill hourly. And if they've done their math right and they've taken into consideration not every single, but as many of the factors that they can, hourly can be a useful tool to bill, I think. But it's
limiting.
It's limiting. Yes.
It's limiting, and it doesn't reflect unless you keep raising your hourly rates. It's limiting. Also, the hourly rates can work against you.
Yeah.
Because your hourly rate might be, $500-$600 an hour, but the job that's being asked of you is only worth $200, $300, but you spend an hour on it, and you tell the client, "Hey, we're billing you $600," but the value to the client really is only $200 or $300.
Yeah.
And so in that case, the hourly billing works against you. And so that's why we set our fees based on the value of the service to the client, not based on, how much time we put in. That's another thing. Okay, what if we had some new people working on those projects and they were just gaining experience, but they're being monitored by somebody who had a bunch of experience? Well, the number of hours may have gone over budget.
Right.
That doesn't change the value of the service to the client.
Sometimes that's so hard for me when I'm billing. I see sometimes those, because, even though we don't bill hourly, I still see those hourlies. And that's something I've had to kind of teach myself to not really focus too much on, because it's so scary to see like a project that should have only taken 6 hours take 20. And you're like, oh my God, we went way over budget. And you didn't. It's a learning experience. And
yes, that was training. We paid for training in that instance.
Right.
So that's what we're doing with our, new staff is we'll put them on projects like that. We know it's going to go over our hourly budget, but that's what we're doing. We're paying for that training so that they can become, qualified, certified people. So
that our value can continue
our value overall continues to grow because our staff continues to get trained and learns and has new experiences, new knowledge, and are able to serve more and more clients.
Yeah.
And that's another part about value billing is when you do know your value and know the value of the service, then it makes hiring easier because you have that worked into the pricing model so that you can train and develop new leaders, develop new staff. You can develop new, if you're a construction contractor, new carpenters, finishers, all of those, because you've already built that into the value of the service. All right. There's one more thing I want to talk about, and it's not necessarily in the three things of knowing your cost, knowing your market, and knowing your value, but it's an overall just to educate our entrepreneurs on understanding gross margin versus net profit. One of the things that we talk about in our meetings is the overall revenue and then what our costs are to come up with our net revenue, our net profit. I think a lot of new entrepreneurs don't understand the difference between variable costs and fixed costs, and so they work their pricing based on variable costs, but they forget about the fixed costs. And so I think if you have a pricing model, let's do some tests. like, for the other day, we were doing an analysis on the service that we were offering. And so what you want to do is you want to count up all the costs that you might have for that particular, and what you start with is variable costs. So if you're offering a service, you want to figure out, okay, what's my labor cost for that? What's the next cost? Well, what's my materials cost? All right. So then those are the variable costs. And so, you have your price minus the variable cost. Okay. What's the difference between the price minus the variable cost is called your gross margin. And the gross margin is what can be applied to all the other fixed and administrative costs that you might have. So then you take that number and then you try to figure out, okay, how can we take our overall overhead and apply it in a pricing model? Well, one of the ways you might do that is how many customers do you serve, or how many of those products do you sell? So you take the overall overhead, your fixed costs, which would be your rent, internet, software, any fees that are known and don't change based on the number of units for the year, and then divide that by the number of products sold. And that will give you a per product fixed cost. So that when you then have your gross revenue minus those variable costs, now you can subtract that per unit cost of overhead and come up with what's left over, which would be your net profit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, my eyes are glazing over a little bit because I'm not a math person, but I think that's why you have professionals. I think that's why if I was a business owner, I would maybe consider having some sort of consulting with someone like you, a business advisor, and go over this with you so you could help me get it over my head. But right. I think for most people who are business owners, maybe it wouldn't go over their head as much as it goes over mine. But I can see the equations. It's right. A matter of applying it to something that makes sense.
Right. And that's just another analysis that you can do. And if you want us to help you, just give us a call. Our firm will help you come up with that pricing model and do a competitor analysis and price analysis for your products and services if you want us to. But just knowing the difference between your gross margin and your net profit. The gross margin, includes those materials and labor, but then the net profit, you have to subtract overhead, and coming up with overhead has been tough for a lot of business owners.
Yeah.
How do I calculate my overhead, but on a per unit basis? Well, that's really tough because then, like for our firm, we don't have just one product that we sell. We have various products or various revenue streams. And whereas this one revenue stream is, 60% of our overall revenue, this other revenue stream might be 40% of our overall revenue. Right. And so then you have to break up, and it gets real complicated. You break up your overhead between those two costs or revenue streams to come up with an overhead per unit overhead amount, so that you can test whether or not the pricing that you've come up with is actually going to make you money.
Right.
And that's an analysis that we can help you do. So anyway, thanks for joining us today. Maggie, did you learn something?
I did. Mm-hmm.
All right. Do you think this is helpful for our business owners?
Yeah. I mean, I think that thinking about these things isn't something that you initially do, right? That's why people struggle. And that's why people have these issues, is because you think of, my price needs to be this because I want it to be, or because and so taking these things into consideration might not be someone's first inclination. So it's nice. I think it'll be helpful to give people tips on where to stop and think and where to, what to take into consideration.
Yeah, how to analyze, their sales and how to analyze their pricing to see if they're actually, asking for enough for that particular product.
Right.
Another advantage of the pricing model is it might get you thinking about, well, maybe my overhead is too much.
Yeah.
Maybe some things I need to cut because, my per unit overhead is putting me out of the money to where I'm no longer having profit. There's
Right.
nothing left over after subtracting variable costs and overhead. There's nothing left over, but I don't have any room to go up because I'm at the top of my market in price.
Right.
We did our competitor analysis and found that, we're actually 20% higher than our competitors, even with the additional add-ons or things that we do for them. We might be a little. So what do we do?
Yeah.
We have to adjust our overhead. We have to adjust our labor price. We have to do something to get back in the money to where there is something left over after your overhead costs.
Yeah.
So again, thanks you guys for listening to Coaching for Profit. I'm Brandon Moore, and this is Maggie Daniel. She's Executive Director of Operations. Feel free to give us a call, give us a like, give us a review. Take care. We love you guys. Our hope and knowledge is that profit equals your potential minus any barriers.
I also wanted to throw in that BCAM PC just started a new short video series on our Facebook that has like quick 10-minute long videos that are just like helpful things for business owners and individuals alike. And so we're posting those monthly. And so if you think these are helpful, these are a little bit long, the podcasts are a little bit longer, and these little short videos are short and quick and helpful. So go like our Facebook while you're liking our podcast.
Right. Thank you guys.
Thanks.